Bob Lazar, the man who first exposed Area 51's secrets, is back with another jaw-dropping claim.
My name's Bob Lazar. I'm known for working at a classified base.
This time, he says the government had no choice but to shut down the site after something was captured there, something nobody was ever meant to see.
And there, we reverse engineered alien spacecraft.
What could possibly be extraordinary enough to close one of the most guarded locations on the planet? Stick around as we dig into Lazar's newest claims and try to uncover what actually happened at Area 51. The extraterrestrial organism. Bob Lazar first put Area 51 on the map in 1989 with a claim that sounded extraordinary at the time. The government was reverse engineering alien spacecraft in a facility hidden next to the base. 3.5 decades later, he's back with something that makes that original claim look almost tame by comparison. He's been careful about how he frames it. What he says he witnessed at Area 51 and S4 in the 1980s was, in his words, beyond anything he had imagined at the time. But what he's now describing as having happened more recently, he says, operates on a completely different level. The government, according to Lazar, had to shut down parts of the facility because they captured something they could no longer contain. Something so extraordinary that exposing it to the public simply wasn't an option. This wasn't another disk, another piece of hardware, another propulsion system to study. Lazar says it was alive. He describes the entity as unlike any known life form on Earth and frames the danger less in terms of physical threat and more in terms of what its mere existence would mean. According to Lazar, the shutdown at Area 51 isn't a short-term precaution. He frames it as a long-term plan to reassess the facility and lock it down more securely than before, suggesting whatever protocols were in place before weren't built to handle a scenario like this one. The government, predictably, has neither confirmed nor denied any of it. Area 51 remains as restricted as it's ever been, and nothing about recent activity at the base has been independently verified by outside observers, satellite trackers, or journalists who cover the site closely. But there's a pattern to unravel here. In 2022, the Pentagon formally stood up the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, specifically tasked with investigating unidentified anomalous phenomena reported by military personnel, and that office has continued publishing periodic reports to Congress ever since, meaning there is now an actual standing government body whose entire job is to look into exactly the kind of claim Lazar is making. Even if nothing it has published so far confirms anything close to a captured living being. Whether Lazar's latest claim turns out to be the next real chapter in the Area 51 story, or simply his most dramatic swing yet, it's landing at a moment when the idea of the government quietly studying things it won't talk about publicly isn't nearly as far-fetched as it would have sounded in 1989. But what exactly led to Bob Lazar's claim in 1989 that made him one of the most argued over figures in the UFO world today? Getting a story nobody wanted. Long before Bob Lazar became a household name in UFO circles, he was just a guy George Knapp put on a Sunday morning public affairs show because a scheduled guest didn't show up. It started in 1987 when a pilot named John Lear walked into the KLAS-TV newsroom in Las Vegas carrying a stack of documents. Lear already had some credibility with the station. He had earlier tipped off the reporter's managing editor, Ned Day, about a secret aircraft flying out of Tonopah and Area 51 that turned out to be the stealth fighter, the F-117, and that tip had turned into a story that went national. So when Lear came back with a new stack of papers and told Ned Day this was going to be the biggest story in history about a UFO cover-up, aliens on Earth, and recovered alien technology, the newsroom at least knew who he was. However, Day looked at it and refused outright. If it were true, he said, he'd already know about it. George Knapp, the reporter, who happened to be listening in, thought it was at least worth a look. He was hosting a half-hour public affairs interview show that aired Sunday mornings at 6 a.m. to essentially nobody, usually filled with interviews with city councilmen and county commissioners. He figured he had nothing to lose putting Lear on. Lear used the airtime to lay out his theory of secret government treaties with extraterrestrials and a massive cover-up. Some of it sounded outrageous. Some of it, Knapp thought, seemed worth checking out. A few months later, Lear hinted to Knapp that he knew someone who might be about to start working at Area 51 and might know something about alien technology. He didn't give a name. Then Then, by coincidence, Knapp was anchoring the 5 p.m. news, and the scheduled guest for a live 5-minute interview segment failed to show. Scrambling for a replacement, Knapp remembered Lear's tip and called to ask if his mystery contact would do an interview. It turned out that Mann, later revealed to be Bob Lazar, had been going through a difficult stretch personally and felt genuinely threatened. He agreed to talk, on the condition his face was blocked out. That interview aired on May 24, 1989, under the pseudonym Dennis. In it, Lazar laid out the basics. He had worked at a facility called S4 near Area 51. He had seen 9 flying saucers inside an underground base. The technology involved came from somewhere other than Earth, and he feared for his life. Knapp says the phone started ringing off the hook almost immediately. His news director rushed in, asking if it was real. The station realized they had touched a nerve they didn't fully understand yet. Knapp and his news director, Bob Stoller, met with Lazar in person the following weekend and spent hours questioning him about his background and how he'd gotten the job. They walked out of that meeting thinking there was reputational risk for the station here and the whole thing could blow up in their faces, but they decided to take their time and dig deeper before running anything more. That meant an 8-month crash course in ufology for Knapp, reading everything he could find, attending that year's International MUFON Symposium, which happened to be held in Las Vegas, interviewing researchers who came right to him, and traveling to Los Alamos. At one point, Lazar took Knapp's crew into a lab with cameras rolling, walking through it like it was a place he knew intimately, waving to people, with no security stopping them at all. Knapp put the full story together, and it aired that November. It went, in his words, through the roof, and it landed almost immediately on Paranet, an early precursor to the modern internet where UFO researchers traded information. That single decision is the reason Bob Lazar exists as a public figure at all, and it's the reason Area 51 became a household name rather than staying a classified footnote in the Nevada desert. But how did Area 51's story actually begin? How Area 51 began. Before any of the UFO mythology existed, Area 51 was just an unusually remote patch of Nevada desert that almost nobody wanted. Prospectors found silver and led near the Groom Lake Salt Flat back in 1864, and in 1889, a man named Patrick Sheehan built a small homestead there called Groom Mine. Las Vegas itself wasn't even incorporated as a city until 1905, and it had no rail access until the year after, so the Sheehan family's property sat about as isolated as land in the American West could get. That isolation is exactly what made the site useful decades later. In 1941, government agents surveyed the region for use as a bomber training ground and an airfield called Indian Springs Auxiliary. Field number 1 went up 6 miles from the old homestead, on the same ground Area 51 occupies today. A decade later, in 1951, the Department of Energy started nuclear detonation testing 20 miles away at what became the Nevada test site. For a while after World War II, though, the little training airfield itself sat mostly dormant. Everything changed with a very specific national security problem. In March 1954, President Dwight Eisenhower, worried the U.S. was dangerously in the dark about Soviet military capabilities, pulled together a team of specialists to figure out how to get real intelligence on what Russia was actually building. The clear answer was aerial surveillance, which meant the U.S. needed both a cutting-edge spy plane and somewhere secret enough to build and test it. A scouting team flew over the Groom Lake Salt Flat, saw a remote, empty stretch of desert that already had an old airstrip sitting on it, and decided it was exactly what they needed. Lockheed engineer Kelly Johnson, who led development of the new spy plane, gave the site its early nickname Paradise Ranch, a deliberately ironic name meant to make an empty, cultureless patch of desert sound appealing enough to recruit engineers willing to relocate there. Workers who took the job leaned into the joke and started calling themselves ranch hands, despite there being essentially no nightlife, greenery, or amenities to speak of for miles. That first spy plane built at Paradise Ranch was the U-2, which could fly above 65,000 feet, a full 25,000 feet higher than the ceiling the public assumed any aircraft could reach at the time. Pilots on ordinary commercial routes who happened to glimpse a U-2 at dusk, catching sunlight at an altitude no plane was supposed to be able to reach, started reporting flying saucers and burning discs to air traffic control throughout the late 1950s. The Air Force Force actually did investigate a wave of these reports under a program codenamed Project Blue Book starting in 1942, though rather than confirm anything unusual, the effort mostly cross-referenced sighting reports against classified flight logs the public didn't have access to, then told witnesses their sightings were most likely weather phenomena. It was an awkward explanation given that the actual cause was an experimental aircraft the government wasn't ready to acknowledge existed. That mismatch, secret aircraft testing paired with public explanations that didn't quite add up, is arguably the actual origin of Area 51's UFO reputation, decades before Bob Lazar ever entered the picture. The base kept expanding and evolving through the Cold War. By 1964, what had started as a single spy plane testing strip had been converted into a full spy plane factory, with its runway extended from 5,000 feet to 8,500 feet to handle faster aircraft, plus new hangars, water infrastructure, and fuel storage. The facility produced a run of genuinely historic aircraft over the following decades: the U-2, the Lockheed A-12, the SR-71 Blackbird, and the stealth F-117 Nighthawk all trace their origins back to Area 51's runways. For decades, the government simply refused to confirm the base existed at all. That didn't change until August 2013, when the CIA released a formerly classified 400-page history of the U-2 and Oxcart programs that, after a National Security Archive researcher spent 8 years pushing through Freedom of Information Act requests, finally used the name Area 51 openly and placed it on an official map for the first time. Even then, the declassified history made no reference to anything extraterrestrial, only spy planes, exactly the kind of secrecy that had been fueling alien rumors for half a century in the first place. And those rumors are exactly what Bob Lazar confirmed in his story. What was his claim exactly? A piece of evidence science confirmed. The single detail that keeps the Bob Lazar story alive decades after is element 115. Back in 1989, when Lazar first started talking about a super heavy element powering an alien spacecraft, element 115 didn't exist on any periodic table anywhere. It was a purely theoretical entry. Physicists suspected something might eventually be built at that atomic number, but nobody had ever actually created or observed it. That changed in 2003. A joint team of Russian and American scientists at the Joint Institute for Nuclear Research in Dubna, working alongside researchers from Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in California, fired a beam of calcium-48 ions at a target made of americium-243 inside a particle accelerator. The collision fused the two elements together and produced 4 atoms of a new super-heavy element with 115 protons in its nucleus. It took over a decade of additional confirmation work before the discovery was formally accepted. The International Union of Pure and Applied Chemistry didn't officially recognize the element until December 2015, and it wasn't given its permanent name, moscovium, after the Moscow region where much of the research was based, until November 2016. That's somewhere between 14 and 27 years after Lazar first started describing a material by that exact atomic number. But the details don't fully line up either, and this is where the story gets complicated. Lazar has always insisted the craft ran on a stable version of element 115, something you could hold, store, and use repeatedly as fuel. The moscovium scientists have actually created is the opposite of stable. Its most durable known isotope, moscovium-290, has a half-life of roughly 220 milliseconds, meaning half of any sample decays away in about 1/5 of a second. Researchers produce it 1 atom at a time, and each atom is gone before most people could finish saying the word moscovium. It took a dedicated detection instrument, nicknamed Fiona, built by scientists at Lawrence Livermore, just to confirm the element's atomic mass in 2018, catching roughly 1 atom of the stuff per day. Lazar's own explanation is that the version of the element he saw wasn't Earth-made. The theory goes that it may have formed naturally somewhere near what scientists call an island of stability, a predicted region of the chart of Nucleides where extremely heavy elements, made under the right natural conditions, could last far longer than anything humans have managed to synthesize in a lab. Nuclear physicists take the island of stability seriously as a real theoretical possibility, but whether that idea has anything to do with an alien spacecraft sitting in a Nevada hangar is obviously a separate question entirely, and nobody has ever produced a sample to test. How witnesses were shut off. Now, after Bob Lazar went public in 1989, something happened that Knapp still describes as genuinely disturbing. People who called in with information started getting visited. Knapp had put out an open call after the story aired, inviting anyone who had worked at Area 51 or S4 or had information about it to come forward. 6 people reached out and offered information over the phone. According to Knapp, every single one of them was visited shortly after their call, before they'd told anyone else, before they'd gone public with anything. One was a man who did tax returns for people stationed at Nellis Air Force Base and had picked up secondhand information about crashes. Another was a golf pro at Nellis, who'd gone on road trips with officers and heard stories about strange things happening out at the base. He was told to stay quiet after his visit. A third was a woman who had previously worked as a stenographer for a defense contractor called Holmes and Narver, and who told Knapp she had sat in on meetings between government contractors and Air Force officials discussing crash saucers, meetings after which the tape would reportedly be pulled from the typewriter and destroyed. The day after she talked to Knapp, 2 men in suits visited her, reminded her she was still bound by her security clearance, and mentioned specifically that she traveled to see her daughter in Los Angeles, and that it was a big, empty desert out there. Knapp has said she was clearly terrified and that he didn't believe she had made any of it up. Whether or not that was a coordinated intimidation campaign, the pattern Knapp describes is one of the more unsettling parts of the entire saga. It also raises a fair question about Knapp himself. Why wasn't he ever visited the same way? The likeliest answer is that going after a working television journalist directly would have created exactly the kind of public attention the whole strategy was designed to avoid, whereas a tax preparer or a stenographer had no institutional protection and no audience if they went missing or disappeared from the story. That's part of the answer to a question a lot of people ask. What actually happened to Bob Lazar after 1989, and why did he go quiet for so long? Well, he didn't disappear because he stopped believing his own story. According to people close to him, he went quiet because the fallout from going public nearly cost him everything. His marriage fell apart in the aftermath, reportedly because the surveillance that came with his security clearance revealed his wife was having an affair. He spent the better part of 3 decades running a small chemical supply business and Nevada's annual amateur fireworks event, largely avoiding the spotlight except on 2 occasions. First was in 2018, when Jeremy Corbell's documentary brought him back into public view and onto Rogan's podcast, and then again in 2017, technically before the documentary was released. However, this event was revealed to the public because of it when the FBI and Michigan State Police raided his company, United Nuclear Scientific Equipment and Supplies. At the time, and for years afterward, true believers assumed the raid was the government finally coming to reclaim a hidden sample of element 115. Lazar has never confirmed or denied having one. When a reporter directly asked him whether he possessed a fragment of it, he said flatly that even if he did, he wouldn't reveal it just to prove his story. Since Lazar wasn't keen on proving his story right, a lot of investigation has been done into them, and here are some of the results: the lies and the half-truths. So did Bob Lazar actually work at Area 51? The honest answer, based on everything currently public, is probably yes, in some capacity, but almost certainly not with the credentials or the specific access level he's claimed since 1989. Here's what the paper trail actually shows. Lazar has said he earned a master's degree in physics from MIT and a second master's in electronics from Caltech. Neither school has any record of him ever attending. Skeptics, including physicist Stanton Friedman and paleontologist Donald Prothero, have pointed out that his own high school academic record, reportedly in the bottom third of his class, with only 1 science course taken, makes admission to either institution extraordinarily unlikely on its face. His claim of working as a physicist at Los Alamos National Laboratory tells a similar story, with one important wrinkle. Officially, the lab has told multiple journalists over the decades that it has no personnel records for a Robert Lazar, but there is a real 1982 profile of Lazar in the Los Alamos Monitor, the local newspaper, describing him and his hobby of building jet-powered cars. And separately, Knapp found an internal Los Alamos phone directory from that era listing a Robert Lazar. The most likely explanation based on later reporting is that Lazar really was in Los Alamos and really did have some kind of access to the facility, but as a technician employed through a staffing engineering contractor called Kirk Mayer that supplied support workers to the lab, not as a credentialed physicist hired directly. When Knapp tried to get Kirk Mayer to hand over Lazar's actual employment file, the company initially agreed, then went quiet. He wrote letters for 2.5 years. By the end of it, Kirk Mayer told him flatly that Lazar had never worked there at all, a complete reversal from what they'd told him at the start. That's the general shape of almost every credential Lazar has claimed, a kernel of something real, wrapped in exaggeration that falls apart under scrutiny. His employer for the alleged S4 job, the defense contractor EG&G, has stated it has no records of him either, and his claimed connection to Nellis Air Force Base has been separately disputed by the Air Force. And then there's the criminal record. In 1990, less than a year after his story first aired, Lazar pleaded guilty to a pandering charge connected to an illegal brothel operating in Nevada. He was accused of being a business partner and of installing a hidden camera system to record activity in an adjoining apartment. There are arguments that a felony charge like that, combined with a documented pattern of resume exaggeration before he ever went public, undercuts the idea that he'd have passed the kind of background check a genuinely top-secret program would require. But Lazar's defenders argue almost the opposite, that a flawed, blackmailable hire is exactly the kind of person a program built around deniability might actually prefer. Also, a researcher at the University of Hong Kong, who reviewed the case in 2023, concluded that while Lazar's credibility is genuinely disputed, and there's no objective evidence supporting his claims, there's also no objective evidence that definitively disproves the alien-related parts of his story either. However, it appears the biggest evidence to confirm his story is a document that was just leaked. How a confirmatory document was exposed. This document is known as the Wilson Memo, and Korbel has staked credibility on saying, flatly, that it's genuine. The memo describes a meeting between a scientist and a sitting admiral, reportedly recounted around 2001 or 2002, connected to the defense contractor EG&G. In the conversation, the admiral, later identified as Admiral Thomas Wilson, at the time a deputy director at the Defense Intelligence Agency, explains that he had learned of a special access program dealing with recovered technology and tried to get read into it, only to be denied. He was, according to the memo, an admiral with serious security clearance, and he still couldn't get access because the program in question was reportedly controlled by a private contractor rather than the government directly. Korbel's read on that detail is that it lines up with something Lazar himself has said for years, that this kind of research gets shelved for roughly 8 to 10 years at a time, brought back out once material science has caught up, and that whoever is holding the technology keeps it inside private industry precisely because government programs leak. The memo's origin traces back to physicist Eric Davis, who has said he documented his own account of a 1997 conversation with Wilson and then formally wrote it up in 2002 after reconfirming the details with Wilson directly. The person Korbel says leaked the document publicly was, at the time, an employee of Robert Bigelow, the aerospace and hotel entrepreneur who has spent decades personally and later publicly funding research into exactly this kind of phenomenon. And Bigelow's name is where this story connects to something that isn't disputed at all: real government money. Bigelow previously owned a Utah cattle ranch known as Skinwalker Ranch, a property associated for decades with reports of strange lights, unexplained animal deaths, and equipment malfunctions. In 2008, the Defense Intelligence Agency awarded a $20 million contract, inserted into a defense appropriations bill with help from then Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, to a Bigelow-run company called Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies, or BAASS, under a program named the Advanced Aerospace Weapons System Applications Program, AAWSAP. BAASS was the only company that bid on the contract, and it used a significant portion of that funding to study Skinwalker Ranch directly, alongside broader research into military encounters with unidentified aircraft. That program later evolved in a scaled-down and more narrowly focused form into AATIP, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, which is the name most people actually recognize, because it was the subject of a major 2017 New York Times story that first revealed the Pentagon had been quietly studying UFOs for years. That article named Luis Elizondo as the program's director, who said publicly that he believed the Pentagon had recovered genuine unidentified aircraft for study before he resigned from the position in 2017, a claim that later reignited significant public and congressional interest in the topic. So, was Bob Lazar right? Corbell's own framing, after years spent closer to Lazar than almost any other journalist or filmmaker, is that you don't need to believe any single person's account completely to accept that something important is going on. Lazar, in his view, is simply one of the more interesting individual cases, not because his story is fully proven, but because pulling on any one thread of it leads somewhere that turns out to be at least partly real, whether that's a phone directory listing, a newly synthesized element, or a government contract with an actual dollar figure attached to it. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more fascinating stories.